Hello, welcome to my TED Talk. I feel actually, it's the last thing I should be doing. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. I know we're just starting to do in-person events, and I probably could have talked my way into doing this virtually, but it's so much more fun and gratifying to do it in person. So thank you for being here. Although thank those of you too also who are watching it through the streaming service. Okay, so when people ask me what this book is about, I often say that it is family biography as regional history. That is through the exploits of 3 generations of one family. I attempt to tell the history of the economic, social, cultural, and political development of Alabama and the larger South, from the end of the Civil War to the end of World War II. If you point to any significant development during that period, if you just dig a little bit, you're going to find Bankhead fingerprints. The Bankheads are what I would call the South's most powerful, important, but ultimately forgotten political family. And we can maybe talk a little bit later about why so many people don't know who they are. Their name graces places and spaces across Alabama: the Bankhead National Forest, Bankhead Tunnel, Bankhead Lake, Bankhead Highway. But few people could tell you about the people who made those things possible. Once when I was describing my project to somebody and the accomplishments of the family, they had this sort of aha moment. And they said, oh, the Bankheads are the Kennedys of the South. And I said, you have it exactly backwards. The Kennedys were the Bankheads of the North. So my talk today, I'm going to try to do 2 things. The first is to kind of give you the high points of the book, and really to talk about their influence, right? An influence that stretched, you know, really past the end of the Civil War, or past the end of World War II, but that's pretty much where I'm going to stop. But I also want to talk about their relationships with each other, right? At the end of the day, this is also a book about a family. Okay, I guess I have a pointer here, right? So why were the Bankheads so influential? Well, a Bankhead, sometimes several Bankheads simultaneously, occupied state or national political office almost continuously from the end of the Civil War until the end of World War II. And as you see here, I do focus on 5 Bankheads: John Bankhead Sr., his sons, John Jr. and William, his daughter Marie, and to a much lesser degree, because this is ultimately a book about Alabama, his granddaughter Tallulah. John Sr. served in the Civil War. He was in the state legislature during Reconstruction. He was warden of the state prison. He served as a congressman for 20 years, and then as a United States Senator from 1907 until his death in 1920. And he was the last surviving Confederate soldier to serve in the United States Senate. His oldest son, John Jr., served briefly as a state legislator as a young man, but later was elected to the Senate in 1930 as a much older man, and he held that position until his death in 1946. Second son, William, was elected to Congress in 1916, where he stayed until he died. He ascended the ranks of Democratic Party leadership, and he was elected Speaker of the House during Roosevelt's second term in 1936. Daughter Marie Bankhead Owen became director of this institution, the Alabama Department of Archives and History, in 1920, following the untimely death of her husband, Tom Owen, who had founded the archives. She was the first woman to run a state agency, and she did so for 35 years. Much of the Bankheads' impact came in the form of public policy. Thus, politics serves as this book's narrative spine. Over the course of 2 generations, they were instrumental in expanding the reach of the federal government to aid Southern economic development. John Bankhead Sr.'s time in national office, first as a member of Congress and then as a senator, coincided with the period historians call the New South. This was an era marked by rapid industrialization and urbanization, particularly the growth of interior cities like Atlanta and Birmingham. And it was a time in which the connection of the relatively isolated South with the economic life of the nation was critically important. Although most Southerners, black and white, would continue to make their living from the land, until the end of World War II, thousands of men and women across the state and region abandoned the farms during this period. They left for the textile mills, the lumber camps, and the coal mines that sprouted up across the region at the end of the 20th century. In order to become industrial or urban, you needed transportation networks, and Alabama and the South were relatively poorly served. Now, we live in a time in which every week is Infrastructure Week, and support for infrastructure is universally accepted as a federal responsibility. Outlays for infrastructure are in the trillions of dollars, and while we may argue about the cost, few would dispute that it is an important federal priority, but this wasn't always the case. And the individual most responsible for making infrastructure development a federal responsibility, as opposed to a state or local responsibility, was John Bankhead Sr. When John Bankhead entered Congress in 1886 as representative of Alabama's 6th district, let me show you his, let's see, pointer. So the 6th district, basically is right around here, right? When he entered it, it was possible to walk across the Black Warrior River, which, let me return to my map again. The Black Warrior, you can see over here, right? It reaches up into the coal region, connects with the Tombigbee, and then makes its way, of course, down to the port of Mobile. It was possible to walk across it. This is a 293 long tributary of the Tombigbee, again, reaches into the rich Warrior coal fields. But in the 1880s, when John Bankhead takes office, it's unnavigable. The river was shallow, it was crooked, cursed with numerous obstructions, and goods could only be shipped down the river in times of high water. And even then, roughly 1 in 8 boats never reached their destination. If going down the river was perilous, going upriver was almost impossible. And so when John Bankhead comes into office, he's determined that he's going to develop the coal region, right? But that's not going to happen if the Black Warrior River doesn't become a true working river. If properly improved, it would provide a crucial link between the coal fields and the port of Mobile, and perhaps Alabama's industrial future would be secured. But that requires money, right? Lots of it. Several attempts were made to develop the river using private capital, but those attempts ended in failure. And Alabama's Constitution forbid the use of state money for infrastructure projects. So determined to develop what he called nature's highways, John Bankhead set his sights on acquiring federal funds. But there was a problem. John Bankhead was a Democrat, and the Democrats were the minority party during much of his years in the House. Nevertheless, by the time he left the House in 1907, he had acquired the reputation as, in the words of one journalist, quote, the greatest procurer of pork for his district who ever strayed north of the Mason-Dixon line. He was, as another journalist put it, a getter. So how did he become a getter as a member of the minority party? Well, he did this by building relationships. He reveled in his role as a legislator. He was an imposing man. He was over 6 feet tall at a time when that was, quite extraordinary. He was affable. He was blessed with what one journalist called a jovial disposition. He was very well liked. And he said there was nothing that couldn't be solved in the haze of a good cigar and a glass of bourbon. And he partook of both, often. And in the committee rooms and offices of Capitol Hill was where he did his work. He was not a speech maker and did not take to the floor often. Republican President Warren Harding and Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge praised his trustworthiness, his good sense, and his abundance of personal charm. And so he secured funding for the development of the Black Warrior and other projects in Alabama by cultivating important relationships with Republicans, particularly those from the developing Western states who had their own water issues. Ultimately, he secured over $15 million, which in today's dollars is about $600 million, to create the elaborate lock and dam system that made the Black Warrior a true working river. In his honor, the final lock, which is Lock 17, was at the time created Bankhead Lake, which of course they named after him. And at the time, it was the biggest engineering project undertaken to date in the country. But John Bankhead's greatest achievement was as the author of the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916, which is the first piece of legislation to provide a funnel of federal funding for the creation of highways. Now, the state of roads in early 20th century Alabama was beyond pitiful. There was no system. There also, really weren't many cars. Existing roads had grown organically out of animal paths, Native American hunting and trading trails, or in some very limited cases by the military. They were rough, rutted, overgrown with vegetation, poorly engineered, and impassable during heavy rains. And they were a county responsibility. Existing roads were maintained by the male citizens in the individual counties. All men ages 18 to 45 had to work up to 10 days per year on road creation and maintenance. It was not a terribly efficient or effective system. It took a really long time. Now, he wasn't the only person interested in getting federal money for roads. Between 1903 and 1916, hundreds of bills were introduced, but none of them got any traction until his finally did. Right, he's able to break the legislative and constitutional logjam, again, through persistence, patience, and creativity. His piece of legislation appropriates $75 million over 5 years. And it's impossible to overstate how revolutionary this program was. Not only did it accelerate the creation of roads across the nation, especially at a time when roads were needed. This is just prior to America's entrance into World War I, and we need several transportation networks for mobilization. Within a few years, appropriation for roads dwarfed every other type of appropriation from federal to state altogether. It also sets a precedent of federal oversight. You couldn't just build roads willy-nilly. You had to create a bureau, right? There had to be a state agency. There had to be certain types of material used. You had to make sure it connected with different things. You just couldn't slap them down wherever you want. Okay, so again, this is something that we now take for granted, but again, it took patience, it took ingenuity, it took persistence, and probably this accomplishment more than any other, I think, really defined John Bankhead's skill and his legislative prowess, and of course, his indispensable contribution to the development of Alabama and the South. Moving on to his sons, right? Congressman William Bankhead and Senator John Bankhead Jr. became a formidable legislative team during the New Deal years and sort of continued their father's, practice, right, of getting federal money for Southern development. John Jr. was recognized as the foremost spokesman for the cotton economy, and he became President Roosevelt's chief agricultural advocate in the Senate in the 1930s. He was instrumental in constructing an agricultural support system that cemented farmers' dependence on the federal government for the remainder of the 20th century. He also offered one of the era's most radical endeavors to address the systemic problem of tenancy and rural poverty. Will Bankhead, like I said earlier, his claim to fame was leadership. He first was chairman of the Rules Committee, and during the hectic days of the early New Deal, often called, right, Roosevelt's 100 days, it was Will Bankhead who basically established the rules for considering pieces of legislation. And essentially he said, there's going to be no debate. There aren't going to be any amendments. We just have to get this through. And he can do that because he's been in Congress since 1916. And one thing that his father told him, he said, learn the rules. Right, learn the rules. Will Bankhead spends his early years as a Democrat in a Republican Congress, right? If you're going to get anything done, you have to learn the rules. You have to learn how to find compromise. And then finally, when the Democrats are in power, this is Will Bankhead's sort of time to shine. As majority leader, and then finally as speaker. Did I just do something? Sorry. And then finally, as speaker during Roosevelt's tempestuous second term, Will deployed his personal charisma, considerable political skills to keep the often unruly Democratic majority together and focused. We hear a lot today about, right, especially in the Senate, how narrow the majority is and how difficult that is. He speaks frequently, Will Bankhead does, about having an unwieldy majority, because if you have a really big majority, people feel free to break into factions. And he worried about that constantly. And in fact, I think it had ultimately had an impact on his physical health. That Roosevelt was able to accomplish anything during his second term. Again, nobody knew he was going to run for a third term. That's something that only we know. People saw him as a lame duck. They didn't feel like they need to give him anything. The fact that he did have some meaningful accomplishments, I think, is largely due to Will Bankhead's leadership in keeping that majority together. If harnessing the power and funds of the federal government for Southern advantage was a critical component of the Bankhead South, so too was the oppression of African Americans, as well as their exclusion from the benefits of federal intervention. In their various political positions, or public positions, John Hollis Bankhead Sr. and his son John Jr. in particular contributed significantly to the economic marginalization, social deprivation, and political disfranchisement of the state's Black citizens. The son of a slaveholder and soldier for the Confederate States of America, John Hollis Bankhead returned to Alabama in 1865, determined to limit the revolutionary potential of Reconstruction. As state senator, John Sr. voted against the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which established federal citizenship for all born in the United States. As warden of the state prison, it was John Sr. who engineered the expansion of the convict lease, wedding its expansion to the state's budding coal industry, providing the industry with a steady stream of cheap labor and the state with a lucrative revenue stream, while consigning thousands of mostly Black convicts convicted of petty crimes to a miserable and deadly existence underground. Now, the father's adherence to white supremacy was transmitted to the sons. As a young state legislator, John Jr. crafted legislation that put into effect the various voting obstacles that strip most Black male citizens of their voting rights. And then as members of the US Congress and the Senate respectively, Will and John were instrumental in placing New Deal work and relief measures within what one historian has called a Southern cage. As a powerful bloc within the Democratic majority, Southern members of Congress designed New Deal programs and benefits in a way that blunted their revolutionary potential by ensuring that they were funneled primarily to white recipients. The Bankheads' political power was reinforced by their ability to shape Southern culture, convincing the coal miner, the textile worker, and the small farmer of the wisdom and legitimacy of the traditional white ruling class, of whom the Bankheads are prominent members, was a complex proposition. And it involved the dissemination of a particular set of ideas about race, about class, and about history that shored up the elite's claims to cultural and political hegemony. In both the political and cultural efforts to secure white supremacy and affirm the superiority of the traditional ruling class, of which, again, the Bankheads were prominent members, the family played a critical role. Marie Bankhead Owen led this effort, first through her club and literary work, but more powerfully during her 30-plus year reign as director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Marie used her position as head of the state's most influential historical and cultural agency to promote a particular history of the story of Alabama. She romanticized the antebellum era and rural life generally. She legitimized secession. She heralded the heroism of the Confederate soldier, minimized contributions of poor whites, and all but erased any contribution of African Americans entirely from the history of the state. She also wrote really, really terrible fiction, which I encourage you to read if you have a spare moment. It's so bad that often she has African-American characters. Sometimes she doesn't give them new names. She just kind of recycles old names, which, shows you she really did not often see African-Americans as individuals. And that's reflected in her terrible fiction. Now, because this is a book about the South, the movements of the most famous Bankhead, actress Tallulah, who of course is William's daughter, play a much smaller role than those of her elders. Tallulah Bankhead left Alabama in 1917 to chase fame and fortune in New York at the tender age of 15. 5 years later, she booked passage to London, where she would remain until 1931. Tallulah's theatrical star rose in concert with the new cultural trends. Just as her grandfather, father, and uncle shaped the political world to bring economic benefits that helped to craft a more modern South, Tallulah embodied the energy and possibilities of the new woman. And if people like to talk about Zelda Fitzgerald as the epitome of the new woman, I will fight them because I think it's Tallulah, right? Tallulah, makes her way. I mean, she has a lot of help from her family, but she establishes an independent career on her own, living on her own at a very young age. But of course, she's in London. Although she does return to the United States in 1931, she never again lived in Alabama, and she rarely visited. For Tallulah, returning to life in Alabama was synonymous with failure. Nevertheless, Alabamians claimed Tallulah Bankhead as their own, and she often declared herself a daughter of the South. Celebrity status provided Tallulah a voice and cultural capital, distinct from the more traditional political power wielded by her family. Still, she didn't often shy away from converting her fame into other kinds of power when it suited her. Likewise, the Bankhead men leveraged Tallulah's stardom to confer upon their dynastic political power a certain royal gloss and kind of used each other. Coverage of Tallulah frequently referenced her political bloodlines, while stories about her father, Will Bankhead, highlighted the activities of his famous daughter. Unofficial guardian of the Bankhead legacy, Marie, kept close tabs on her niece, often asking her for money, seeking a job, but always concerned about Tallulah's image because of how it reflected on the family. And she's always looking for ways to leverage Tallulah's public persona to the advantage of the Bankhead name. Conversely, she also moves quickly and sometimes ridiculously to tamp down negative press on Tallulah. And as you know, Tallulah's pretty outrageous. Marie is constantly clutching her pearls at the things that Tallulah does, but she also, I think, she's kind of jealous of Tallulah. Tallulah, I think, has the life and the freedom that she didn't quite have. And so they have a very complex relationship. Of course, Tallulah resists most of the efforts by her, much older aunt to direct her career, but she never rejects her entirely. And Tallulah strategically uses her southernness to her advantage when it suits her. Of course, as I mentioned, this isn't just a political story. It's not just a story of political power. It's also a story of a family, of the relationships between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, and between siblings, and how they grappled with success and failure, triumph and loss. And that's probably the hardest part of this book to write, because you can write about legislation, you can write about the impact of this act or another, but how do you give people, how do you flesh them out? How do you do them justice as fully actualized human beings? Some of them left more evidence of their interior lives than others. William Bankhead, the one who becomes Speaker of the House, is a diarist. So I have lots of diaries from him. Not, they only cover like a couple months, but you can see what he's thinking, and he talks about his feelings. Like, I've never seen a man born in the, last third of the 19th century who's so emotional. John Bankhead Jr., his brother, almost nothing. Marie's somewhere in between. But it sort of reminded me, as I was, kind of working on this book, I was reminded often, I kept it in my head, something that my daughter once said to me when she was 4. I had a TA who had a graduate student who had gone out to California, visited the Nixon Library, came back and brought me a mug that had Richard Nixon's face on it. And my 4-year-old daughter asked me, she's like, well, who is that? And so I thought, okay, you know, here's my chance to like teach her up, right? And so I said, well, he was the, you know, the leader of our country. You know, he did something that people didn't like and he had to be removed. And she looked at it and she said, he's somebody's granddaddy. And I said, you know what? Richard Nixon was somebody's granddaddy. And so, you know, I kind of tried to keep that in mind as I was writing this book. John Bankhead Sr. was a staunch white supremacist, but he was also a devoted father and a loving grandfather. Will Bankhead was a suave and skilled Speaker of the House, beloved by Democrats and Republicans. He was also an alcoholic who neglected his children. Marie Bankhead Owen was a lost cause apologist who did everything in her considerable power to erase Black accomplishment from the historical record. She was also a mother who tragically lost her 5-year-old son. No relationship was more meaningful and poignant to me than the relationship between the brothers, John Jr. and William. And so I want to spend what's left of my time to talk about these two brothers who remain utterly devoted to each other throughout their entire lives. John Jr. was born in 1872. That's him also on the left. William, born 2 years later, 1874. And these men and boys were a study in opposites. John was the oldest son in a family of 5 siblings. He was his father's namesake. Whether because of his inherent temperament, personality, or simply a matter of birth order and expectation, probably a combination, John became his father's right-hand man. And he became and remained ballast for the entire family. Much was expected of John. John was studious and methodical. He attended the University of Alabama, where he was president of his 39-member senior class. After graduating in 1891, he continued to Georgetown University to study law. He excelled in his coursework and was elected president of his class, the first student from a southern state to achieve such a distinction since the end of the Civil War. While in Washington, John Jr. served as a clerk for his congressman father. After graduation, he moved to Jasper and joined the law firm of Ezra Coleman. In 1894, John Jr. married Musa Hawkins, the only woman he had ever dated. John had met Musa when he was 14, and from the moment they met, he was determined that she would become his wife. While still a teen, his father had given him a pig to raise. John, when the pig had a litter, he sold the piglets and used the proceeds to buy her a ring. Later, when he became a working attorney, he used his fees from his first case to buy her a proper ring to replace the pig ring. In almost every conceivable way, Will was John's opposite. If John's life was marked from an early age by responsibility and duty, Will was simply beloved. Everybody loved him. His mother once told him when he was a small boy, and keep in mind, they've got Marie and there's another sister. Will is 4th. Right, there's 3 people older than he is. But when he was a small boy, he was a constant source of joy. They showered him with such affection that strangers would often ask if he was an only child. Sister Marie remembered him as a prankster. He followed John first to the University of Alabama and then to Georgetown. So he was, throughout his life, he is the younger brother. He continues to play that role even as they are older men. Like his brother, he was elected president of his class. Will did not possess John's focus and drive. He was kind of more like his dad, right? He was a people person. He was gregarious. He was affable. He was a joiner who craved new experiences. Where John was studious, methodical, and practical, Will was popular, emotional, and romantic. He was elected class orator at Alabama. He too had a love for the theater. He dreamed of a life in the theater, but his mother forbid it. Being in the theater, right, being an actor was not a reputable or respectable reputation. Also, while at Georgetown, where he also goes for law school, he worked in his father's congressional office. But he also did all the other things that you would expect a young man to do in the big city. He went to art galleries. He hung out at the police court. He attended different churches of a range of denominations. He went to the racetrack and bet on horses, and he dated lots and lots of different women. When time came to graduate from law school, Will had no idea what he wanted to do, but he knew one thing. He did not want to come back to Alabama, and he didn't want to practice law. After trying his hand at various ventures in New York City, he returned to Alabama, not to where his parents or brother lived, but he went to Huntsville, where he became a partner in a law firm. And he was bored. Reading his diary from this period is just like reading the law, the endless law. It's tedious today. I mean, this is a man who is not made for just studying the law. And then he met Ada Eugenia Sledge, who was conveniently engaged to another man. Will burned all the letters, much to my dismay, that he had received from other women. She broke off her engagement, and they married after a brief courtship. 2 children, Eugenia and Tallulah, followed in fairly short order. But then tragedy struck. Jean died from an infection shortly after the birth of Tallulah. Will's father, mother, and sister took turns raising daughters Eugenia and Tallulah, and Will ended up leaving Huntsville and coming to join John's law practice in Jasper. John Jr. at this point assumes a heavy burden. He really, in many ways, was responsible for the family's financial well-being. He oversaw the family's business interests in coal mines. He helped Sister Marie financially, particularly after she was widowed. He served as his father's eyes and ears on the ground in Alabama as he moved from the House to the Senate. And he took care of Will, who is grieving, and he grieves for about 10 years. He struggles to get his life on track. John's dreams take a back seat. He always wanted to be a federal judge, but it never happens because he has all of these other things that he has to do. The relationship between the brothers remained fairly unequal during these years. John struggled, in his words, to, quote, keep Will's mind off sad things. Right? Will was depressed, and he self-medicated with alcohol. Eventually, Will acquired some equilibrium. He ran for Congress in 1914, but lost a very close race. John was once again there to lift him up, and eventually essentially succeeded in redrawing Alabama's congressional map in a way that favored Will. Basically created a district for him. It also conveniently diluted the considerable Republican strength in every single Alabama district. So they created a district that Will could win, which he did in 1916. Unlike his father, Will was a natural orator, and he made his first speech shortly after being sworn in. The country had just entered World War I. Congress was debating whether to institute a draft. And there was strong opposition to the bill, and Will was torn as to how to vote. John ultimately convinced him to support the draft, which Will does after making a dramatic speech that's interrupted numerous times for applause. And this is something that continues throughout their lifetime. When there's an issue and Will's going to take to the floor, he writes to John about it, he gives him advice. They really are each other's best friends. A few days after making the speech, Will received a letter from John congratulating him on the success of his speech, but he wants details. Were you nervous? Right? How did you feel? Tell me everything all about it. So they always share their most significant achievements and their most significant losses with each other. In 1930, just as the Depression was taking hold, John Jr. was elected to the U.S. Senate. Although only a freshman senator, John immediately emerged as a very skillful legislator, laser focused on the problems of rural America, but really the cotton economy. Like I said, he was the chief architect of what became the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Over in the House, with the Democrats firmly in the majority, Will begins to climb the party leadership ladder. Again, he's highly regarded for his way with words, with his parliamentary procedure, his powers of persuasion. I mean, he has to be good because Roosevelt takes a lot of his patronage power away. A lot of the tools of previous speakers of the House are not available to Will, right? So he's just got to, in many ways, use his personal charisma, which is considerable. Journalists spoke of the Bankhead brothers, right? They were often talked about as a team. John would craft legislation, and Will would use his position to, ram it through the House. Will's life, though, continued to be defined by tragedy. Just as his party had gained the majority and he himself was poised to grasp real power, this is in the early 1930s, his body betrayed him. Will suffered at least 2 minor heart attacks by early 1933, but was felled by a major heart attack in 1935 that kept him away from Washington for a year. John did his best to protect his brother and to protect those issues that were important to him. He lied to the press frequently, saying that he just had a cold, he had an attack of indigestion, right? The stories constantly changed, but Will was out of commission basically for a year. The Democrats nevertheless elected him first floor leader while he was laying in a hospital bed. Will did the best that he could to pass the president's agenda from his convalescence in Jasper, but he was frustrated and scared. And being Will Bankhead, he talked about that very, very openly, sharing his fears with his brother, who did his best to keep Will focused on his recovery. Again, when in 1936, Will is elected speaker. It's an achievement of a lifetime. But inside, he's panicking. He had already survived 3 heart attacks. How much more could his body take? The last 2 speakers had died in office. It was known quite openly as a killing job. And again, Will was speaker during Roosevelt's tumultuous second term, right? This is the term where he tries to pack the court. He goes and he campaigns against particularly obstreperous Southern Democrats, right? Members of his own party that he wants to get rid of. This is something that presidents didn't do, right? They were expected to kind of mind their own business and let, local politics kind of take care of themselves, right? So Roosevelt is really, there's a lot of grumbling and there's a growing sort of conservative opposition against him from his own party, many of them from the South. And it's Will's job to kind of keep things rolling. Again, the Democrats expanded their majority in 1936, which encouraged the development of factions. And the New Deal was running out of steam, right? International events are heating up and domestic reform is beginning to take a back seat. And he constantly worries, am I up for this job? He writes about it in his diary. He expresses these fears to his brother. He feels very much that this could kill him. For a while, he's comforted by the fact that he and John live in adjoining apartments, and they do that so John can keep an eye on Will while in Washington. And he wrote frequently about how important it was to him that his brother was so close because he might, as in his words, crack up again. For John, watching his brother try to satisfy the president at the risk of his own health was agony. And I think this very much leads to a rift between John Jr. And the president. As 1940 approached, the question on everybody's mind was, of course, what's Franklin Roosevelt going to do, right? Is he going to run for an unprecedented third term? And the president was cagey. He didn't say anything, which of course freezes all of his competitors, who are, there are many of them, freezes them in place. Still, many men threw their hat into the ring, including Will Bankhead, who did not actively campaign for the nomination, but who allowed the Alabama delegation to gather support for his candidacy. He's incredibly popular. Lots of people like him. Will's position remained that, look, if Roosevelt decides he wants to run again, I'm out. But he did want to put himself forward as vice president. Much of the attraction of being vice president was that it was a much easier job than being speaker, right? He was thinking about his longevity, frankly, if he could survive. Well, Roosevelt waits until the very last minute to declare and accept his party's nomination, much to the annoyance of people at the convention who felt they'd kind of been played by Roosevelt. And they pretty much had. When time came to nominate a vice presidential candidate, and this is a time when, conventions still in many ways had that power. Will Bankhead emerged as an early favorite, but Roosevelt once again put his thumb on the scale and demanded that Henry Wallace, who was his Secretary of Agriculture, be nominated as his running mate. Roosevelt, probably quite appropriately thought Bankhead was too old and too sick. He was by this time, 66 years old, much older, a little bit older than Roosevelt, and of course, pretty weak. Bankhead refused to step aside, which is extraordinary for him. He had done Roosevelt's bidding for a very, very long time, but he refuses to step aside. And there are a lot of delegates who are mad at Roosevelt, right? That once again, he's kind of telling them what to do. But Will simply couldn't overcome the demands of a popular president, right? There's a real exciting, vote counting. Bankhead comes in second, and Henry Wallace, Roosevelt gets what he wants. Henry Wallace is nominated. Will and John, who are good Democrats, send their congratulations to Wallace. But this is kind of it for John Jr., right? He's kind of done with Roosevelt in terms of his trust of the man. He was livid and remained that way over what he considered the president's shabby treatment of his little brother. Well, ever the good political soldier and definitely the party's best orator, Will agrees to campaign on behalf of Roosevelt. And this is going to begin with a speech in Baltimore in September. John begged him not to go. His wife begged him not to go. The secretary begged him not to go. It was hot, it was humid, and Will had a very trying summer. But he ignored the advice. He called himself a good soldier in politics, and he traveled to Baltimore. But he never made the speech. On September 10, 1940, he suffered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, and he collapsed in his hotel room. He rallied briefly, and John, once again, is there to cover. He said there's no reason for alarm, everything's going to be fine. But Will suffered a second rupture and died on September 15th, 1940. He was 66 years old, and his brother was at his side. John Bankhead Jr., once a critical member of Roosevelt's inner circle on questions of agriculture, became increasingly estranged from Franklin Roosevelt. They engaged in many high-profile battles throughout World War II, and perhaps these battles were what they seemed on the surface, difference of policy. But it's also likely that John's differences with President Roosevelt were deeply personal, and that he held him partly responsible for the death of his beloved brother that he had spent a lifetime trying to protect. So I end the book in 1946 with the death of John Bankhead Jr. A year after the end of World War II, Alabama and the South stood at a crossroads. The one-party Democratic South, dominated by the cotton economy and a tiny white elite, a South the Bankheads had helped to create, was beginning to crumble. World War II unleashed powerful economic, social, and political forces that over the course of the next 20 years would render the Bankhead South, if not unrecognizable, at the very least, profoundly altered. So the death of the last Bankhead in 1946 was not just the end of a political dynasty, but it was the end of an era. Thank you.
Frederickson. We have time for some questions. We also have time, if you are online, you can put it in the comments and it'll come through to my phone. So we have a little bit of time. Anyone here wants to ask? Perfect. I'm going to come here so that our online audience can hear. I'm going to hand you the microphone.
I just wondered if the Bankheads have any children, heirs, anyone living now?
Oh, there's Jasper and Walker County are crazy with Bankheads. Yeah, there's a lot of Bankheads left. Most of them a lot of them live out of state, but there's a lot of Bankheads in Jasper and a lot of Bankheads in Birmingham. And in fact, this book was, this project was initiated by a man named John Oliver, who was a longtime trustee at the University of Alabama, a banker from Jasper who was married to a Bankhead. He was married to John Jr.'s granddaughter. So he came to the Department of History, where I work, and said, I think this book might make a good project. And I knew a little bit. I knew about John Sr.'s work as warden, and I'm sure I mumbled something about his convict lease. But he said, warts and all. And so when I was working on this project, I would send him, anybody who wanted to read it, frankly, in the Bankhead Foundation, the family, I would send them chapters. Never, no complaints. They are people of their time. Right. And I guess what I try to do in this book is I try to, I'm not going to shy away from things that they did that, were harmful, but I don't think in that capacity they were exceptional, right? They just had a lot more power than most people did. But I think to the credit of the family, nobody ever made an effort to say, no, you can't say that. You can't talk about this. You can't, whatever. So I think they were very interested in, like I said, having a warts and all treatment of the family. I think they were surprised at how long it took me to write the book. You know, it took over 10 years to research and write it. But, you know, I just kept finding stuff. I mean, literally any major development that you can point to between 1865 and 1945, there's a Bankhead, you know, lurking beneath it in some capacity. I mean, I think they had that much impact on the state. So I'm sure it's much longer than what you wanted. Yes.
Thank you, Doctor, for your effort and the excellent presentation you gave. Who was the last Bankhead of the dynasty of considerable influence to die?
Marie. So I do, even though, you know, the book really covers I liked ending in 1946 with the death of her brother, John Jr., because the South really is in many ways at a crossroads, right? And he has died. He's, you know, that's the death of the last political Bankhead. Marie lives until 1958. You know, she's head of this agency until she's like 85 years old. I mean, there is so much more to be done on Marie. I mean, she really, and her husband as well, right? It's his personal collection that is, you know, the original collection of this facility. This is the first in the country, right? #1, right? And it becomes a model. And then he dies when he's 50, he has a heart attack, and they appoint her. And then she is, you know, in charge from 1920 until I think she retires in 1955. But she is worthy of her own study. She is absolutely fascinating.
And so is Milo Howard.
Yes, yes, absolutely. No, we've benefited from having some really great leadership at this institution, I think far better than many states. And of course, the current leadership is outstanding. Yeah.
Cue the microphone.
Oh, hello there. Didn't see you.
Kari, thank you for your talk and this really important project. So we're grateful for your scholarship. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about John Sr.'s work as, you know, the way you framed this pivotal re-envisioning of the role of the federal government toward infrastructure and spending, but also the oversight of where those federal dollars go. And that's happening at the same time that Alabama and other southern states are banking on Congress's disinterest in what's happening in our state constitutions and the disfranchisement of African Americans and poor whites. Can you talk about the politics of that in Congress, in John Sr.'s thinking, and, you know, is this coming up in as he's trying to gain support among Republicans for what he's trying to do with federal spending?
Right. Well, honestly, by the time, you know, he is able to get the financial ball rolling with regard to the Black Warrior River, it's, you know, the 1890s, and the Democrats or the Republicans have just about given up. Right. They're turning their attention to other things. So the fact that he is looking to benefit from the enhanced power of the federal government in a particular way, I don't see them, you know, sort of arguing with him about that. I think they've just, by that time, you know, Reconstruction's in the past, right? They've kind of turned a page. The Republican Party is much more interested in economic issues themselves, right? They're becoming the party of corporate America. And so, yeah, one thing I didn't mention in that little spiel about his focus on infrastructure is that, yeah, all of this is being accomplished by a states' rights Democrat. Now, and federal oversight is okay so long as it's not oversight of race relations. And Republicans were only too happy to allow that to be the case, right? They did not make any kind of stink about it. And it's very easy to avoid race when you're talking about rivers and roads, right? Those aren't, I'm not saying it's completely inconsequential, right? Where rivers and where roads go, especially, you know, highways, that has strong implications, right? For development, who gets the roads, who gets to succeed, where do the roads go through? But in terms of getting federal money for that, doesn't come up. I never found it. So yeah, good question.
I have a question. You mentioned the Bankhead Tunnel in
Yes.
Mobile, and I wondered for which Bankhead was the tunnel named, and what is the connection between Bankhead and that tunnel?
My sense is, you know, and I this is only from secondary reading because I didn't do any primary research on that. My sense is that it's named for William B. Bankhead, and it was named at a time when he is Speaker of the House. Yeah, because he does have, I think, of all of them, sort of the highest national profile.
Dr. Frederickson, we've had actually a couple of questions that are very similar about the two other siblings and wondering if they were at all involved in politics, if you discussed them in the book, and if you can tell us any little facts about them.
Okay, so the oldest daughter is Louise. Louise eventually runs a girls' school in South Carolina. She marries a much older man. She marries a man, and she's maybe in her early 20s, maybe 20, who is older than her father. And he is a congressman from South Carolina. So I think she meets him when her parents go to Washington. And so she marries him. She loses two children, one pretty close to childbirth. The other is a son that she loses when he's a teenager. He dies of typhoid. She actually accompanies Tallulah on her initial foray to New York City, and she wants to go because she wants to meet with spiritualists who can connect her with her dead son. She dies in, I want to say a lot of people die right around the same time. So Louise dies, I think first, then Tom Owen, Marie's husband, and then John Sr. I think they all die around 1920. But she eventually, she gets remarried, moves to Yonkers, where she can, at one point she oversees Tallulah and Eugenia, who are in a boarding school there. She's kind of their, you know, eyes on the ground, as it were. She eventually ends up, I think, taking care of the elder Tallulah Bankhead, John Sr.'s wife, and moving back to Alabama. Henry, who is in the middle, Henry Macaulay Bankhead, spent his life in the military. He spends his life in the U.S. Army. He, according to Marie, and I wish I had this quote written down, she said, if I was in hell and I wanted to have a good time, or she said, no, sorry, I messed it up. If I wanted to have a good time, I would spend time with Henry. If I had a business problem, I would go to John. Talking about her brother, she said, but if I was in hell and I needed someone to talk our way out, I would rely on William. Henry, I think, spent a lot of his time traveling as a member of the U.S. military. He eventually ends up as an older man as an attaché in Ottawa, Canada. But yes, they play sort of much smaller roles in the book.
Okay, we have, I think, time for one more question.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi.
I was wondering, do you know what Tallulah Bankhead's view of her family's view of white supremacy was?
She didn't like it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, Tallulah was a loyal daughter. And when she would do things, like one time she put her name on some sort of a petition by some sharecroppers group, right, saying that they needed equity in terms of agricultural payments. They were getting screwed from these federal payments that weren't being shared with them. And she would put her name on these petitions. And then her father would convince her, he's like, look, that's a communist group. You're gonna, it makes it hard for me if you do that. And then she would back down. Personally, she is, what I see in their correspondence, she's much less racist than her sister. Her sister writes to her dad. They both write to him frequently, uses the N-word frequently. Her sister does. Tallulah, because Tallulah leaves Alabama at an early age, right? She's in, she's with theater people, for goodness sake, right? So first in the United States, then in London, and then she comes back. I think by the time she comes back, like she's had a lot more experiences, right? She's more sexually adventurous. She's hanging out with people who are decidedly lower class, right? Whereas she is decidedly upper class, right? Her vista is much broader than theirs. Where we really see her, though, distinguishing herself from her family, honestly, is after her father and her uncle are dead. In 1948, in the presidential election, Harry Truman comes out quite aggressively for, he first of all establishes, he desegregates the military. And then he runs on a platform that, supports an anti-lynching bill, fair employment practices in peacetime, no segregation on interstate travel, all of these things that, would have made her father and brother, roll over in their grave. He runs, of course, as a Democrat. In response to that, a bunch of Southerners break away and form something called the Dixiecrat Party, right? Strom Thurmond is their candidate. And it's a white supremacist segregation party, right? And that's their reason for being. Well, Marie's all in on the Dixiecrats. She is a Dixiecrat leader in Alabama. She by far is the most overtly racist, I think, in terms of just things that she says in public, and then her brothers. Tallulah is a Democratic supporter. She turns her back on the Dixiecrats. She overtly supports Harry Truman, and at a time when a lot of Southerners weren't. And then she's ultimately, I think, invited to the inauguration, where I think she ends up like spitting a raspberry at Strom Thurmond when he rolls by. So yes, in terms of race, what I would say in terms of race, her feelings are very different, but she never embarrasses her family by criticizing them publicly.
Can we all join me again in thanking Dr. Frederickson for this amazing book talk?
Thank you.
Thank you. And please remember, you can purchase the book in our museum store or online store, Alabama Original, and come see Justice Not Favor so you can see how Marie worked with women's suffrage in Alabama. So thank you all.